Thank you.
Come in, he said, I'll show you, I'll come in
It's
later.
good to have you guys back.
And so
Travels
when
good?
we got home, we had
Illinois? Alabama?
tea
Okay.
yesterday with the widows thing.
Okay.
So when we got home, they said, come here, get down there. She said,
Okay.
when he come down, he just grinned at me.
77.
Cause he used to tell Casey
I'm so
when
familiar with the
Casey
29
would come in, he'd be
But
sitting
I'm
there,
getting more
Casey
familiar
would
with
come
the
in,
others now that-
Casey, how's that? You might as well sit down, you're getting a lecture.
So,
So when he came downstairs, he just grinned and hugged me.
in Birmingham. But then in July, August, June, two.
Oh, every month I said,
Madison.
I just stopped by the police one day and that
And I
was
haven't been to Madison.
he said, why? He said,
Oh, yeah.
but he's everywhere. And my name's right on Life 360 to see where he is.
Oh, yeah.
So, that night that he came in so late,
Yes, ma'am.
I had looked at it, I looked at the thing, and it was like 10:05, and it says he's 4 minutes from home. So I'm going,
You want to take a picture of it?
highway is 4 minutes from home. So I just turned my phone down.
Oh, yeah, I think so.
I can email it to you if you want me to send you a picture.
10:30.
As long as you don't worry about it.
I can't remember, 10:30, I think it was like 10:35. And it says it's 4 minutes from home.
It's
An
a.
hour later, he's here. I picked it up and it was crossed over
Says
somewhere.
19.
What are you doing? Making progress, but she's lazy, it's just slow going, but. And she called me Saturday night, she was real good. She said, Mom, I'm still an island little guy, but she's
Getting there, working on getting
being a rebel, and I want her to mind. She's better be at church tomorrow morning. She was there.
He's gonna get there.
She said, I'll show them. They're just which I guess she's
I'm not a free for I only dress that way. I only dress that
They
way.
had been the sidelines, because I called them, they had been the sidelines. And, then they went to radio, and the guy that no, the ones in his truck, he gave them to, so they were running,
they were selling out. I was right out at 2 o'clock.
He's going from friend's house to friend's house, delivering donuts. Exactly, yeah.
And that time, I'm sure it wasn't ever, but you never know about other people getting it. Because my daughter had that before. It's just, you know, you can't trust everybody, you can't take care of
And
it.
you know, that's what I told both of the boys, and especially because sure really outgoing with his friends and case of I would always tell them, I don't care.
Yeah, my sister, you don't get too much game, because there's like razor's edge. So I finally found that sweet spot, took a picture of the board, took a bit of a
But you know what they'll do.
It's funny what we use for backup sometimes,
because
yeah.
unfortunately we've had to listen, there's a lot more lately than normal, but it's good.
He told me, we're broadcasting this class, and he told me, he's like, as long as you're somewhat near the he said,
I'm a trusting person, but you can't trust.
And we can hear every question.
They got something from somebody, that one, so they don't ever drink it, order it, you drink it. I think it's worse now than it was. Oh, yeah, oh, yeah.
You guys still get, you got time, don't get quiet yet. No pressure to start.
Oh, yeah. The one right beside Martin's.
That's our favorite, Sunday.
Usually if somebody like run into Lisa.
Yeah, we do too. Schlossky's. Down on 92.
Sunday night.
Somebody else goes there. Oh, y'all go on Sunday.
We go and Lisa's are there.
Yeah, it's such a time, yeah.
And then Larry's on Sarah over there. That's
Well, good morning, everyone. See, I already have a challenge. My computer's gonna wanna go to sleep every other second, so.
In the microphone, Brad?
What's that?
In the microphone?
Les said I didn't. Apparently David's got these all set up now, as long as I talk loud enough. Now, so if I start, because if I talk like I'm teaching, then everything should be fine. If I start droning and winding down, you guys tell me this, or I can put on a mic. So, Andrew, you represent that side of the room. Sarah can let me know in the back if she can't hear me at some point, so. So, always a clown, yes. That's what was being set up here. So, yeah, we are going to broadcast of the two classes. We are going to broadcast this class so that those that are watching online can see this. And if you happen to not be able to be here, you can still be a part of the class. So, thank you guys so much for being here. As I said, I'm not using a mic. You guys let me know either during the class or after the class if I need to alter that. Let's start real quick. I know some other people may be coming in. Let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity that you give us to come together for worship. And while we're here to study and learn more about your word, all the things that you want us to learn about the gospel, but also all those things that you want us to learn about the peoples and the families that were involved in the First Testament, the Old Testament. Lord, help us to open our minds, help us to learn, help us to be involved in this class such that we can apply these things in our lives. Lord, as we know that these are historical facts, we know that there's still opportunities for us to be able to consider how this can impact our lives and help us to not only be better and more effective Christians, but to be able to share the message with others. Lord, thank you again for each person that's involved in this class. Help us to be wise in everything that we study. It's through your Son, Jesus, we pray. Amen. All right, so I will tell you guys right off the bat. Check this, my bookmark.
Very good.
I will tell you guys right off the bat, the book that we're using, you guys, I'll leave it on the table up here right after class. You guys are more than welcome to look through it, to order one. I believe I ordered this through Amazon. It's available through Thomas Nelson, but it is Fascinating Stories of Forgotten Lives by Charles Swindoll. He's written a lot of books. He is, I believe he works with a community church. I'm drawing a blank on exactly the city and state now, but just as a reminder, a little bit about the author, a little bit of information there. But you guys are more than welcome. Apparently this is part of a series called Great Lies from God's Word. But sometimes books like this, I don't know if they just happen to fit or if they are written in such a way, but it aligns very closely with somewhere between 12 or 13 lessons. So it aligns very closely with what makes for a good quarter and a good study from that perspective. We'll go through a little bit about some of the Bible figures that we're going to study. At some point, you guys, I'm going to say Bible characters, and that always feels weird when I say characters because I think of characters as like an animated thing or something from a movie. But that will come out, and I just want to preface that with, I don't mean to say characters. I'm trying to, in my head, I'm trying to say Bible people or whatever. But in a minute, you guys will hear about some of the characters we're going to go through. I just said it, didn't I? Yeah, sorry. Told you guys, at least I prefaced it.
It's abundance of personality.
So let me ask you guys this, just in the context of the book itself. And I don't necessarily need it, but think about, I don't need names or anything, but think about people that you have known in your past that have kind of lived in the shadows. And I don't mean weird shadows. Every time I think of shadows, I don't know, some of you aren't old enough to remember this, but there was a movie from probably the 80s, maybe the 90s. When did Ghost come out? Anyway, there was a movie called Ghost. And the bad spirit, if you will, would, like, there was a shadow on the ground, and all of a sudden the shadow would turn into this bad spirit. And, like, I don't know if you guys remember that, but whenever I talk about somebody living in the shadows, that's what I immediately go to. It's just this little weird shadow thing popping up. But think about people that you guys may know that have lived in the shadows. Does anyone, possibly someone near the front, do either of you guys know how to turn the sleep mode off? Okay. What's that?
What platform?
Yeah, like,
Apple, is that an Apple?
no, it's sorry. I thought you said in the platform. You're asking Mac or otherwise. Oh. You feel free, everything's wide open. Yeah, okay. So think about. So you guys think about those people that in the past that you've known that have they've been absolutely content with just being in the background. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't have a lot of responsibility. It doesn't mean that they don't have skills and talents that God's given them and they're not using them. When I say living in the background, they're doing everything that God wants them to do. It's just that they're not looking for recognition from it. So if you can picture those kind of people, we're going to be looking at some of those. I will tell you that a few of the names that we're going to go through are, and if you don't find it, it's okay, Terry. I will tell you that a few of the names that we're going to go through are names that are a little bit more familiar to us. I'll say Abraham as an example. But you'll see some of these that are a little bit more obscure. These are not the people that you will see the kids dressing up in during VBS a lot of times, right? Because just they're not very well known. But there will be some other ones that you'll have some familiarity with. A couple of things that I want to let you know is sometimes we're not studying for the good that they've done, but we're studying for the challenges that they had and maybe the bad that they've done. Today's person, Cain, is a very good example of that, right? But you guys remind me as we talk about Cain and as we talk about these people in the Old Testament, remind me why do we study, why do we look at the Old Testament?
The New Testament says it's for our learning.
It's for our learning, okay? And so there are, and in fact, you guys know there's a lot of times where something in the New Testament ties to the Old Testament. In fact, we have a couple of scriptures that we'll look at today where we are talking about the section in Genesis of Cain and Abel, but we're going to be looking at Hebrews, right? So there's a section in Hebrews. Any luck, Terry? Awesome, thank you so much. Keep that in mind. Let me give you guys an example of, and you don't necessarily, well, you can turn there. A lot of you guys are on electronic Bibles, so this will be easy for you. Exodus 31. Exodus 31. Let's look at the first few verses there. And then I'll give you guys where we're going to be for the bulk of the day. Exodus 31, 1 through 6. Now, here's what I'd like for you guys to pay attention to. If you're like me, you've read this before. There's a lot of these things that we all probably read before. But I want you to think about the two people that we're going to talk about that are just names to us in here. But I want you to think about the importance of what they have, of what they're doing here. So my particular version has the subheadings. They're always helpful to me, especially in scenarios like this. So chapter 31, first 6 verses, my subheading says instructions for building the tabernacle. Okay? Building the tabernacle, pretty important, right? So let's think about this in Exodus 31. Listen for these couple of names. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "See, I have called by name." Sorry, I'm not going to pronounce all these correctly, so you guys hang in there with me. Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. There's our Hur that you were asking about. The tribe of Judah, and I have filled him with the spirit of God and wisdom and understanding and knowledge and in all manner of workmanship, to design artistic works, to work in gold and silver and bronze, in cutting jewels for setting, in carving wood, and to work in all manner of workmanship. And I have appointed him with Aholiab, the son of Ahisamach, of the tribe of Dan, and I have put wisdom in the hearts of all the gifted artisans, that they may make all that I have commanded you. Okay? So there's two names there, Bezalel and, let me get down to the other one, Aholiab. Okay? So they were gifted with all these talents to help build the tabernacle, but we don't know much about them. I mean, think about how important that was. Think about what they were doing. Think about how they were gifted all these talents. Can you imagine if God gives you talents to build and to do all those things that he just talked about? Can you imagine what you would be able to do? And so it's very interesting to think about how many different people in the Bible. In fact, you guys can probably rattle off a few right now of names where you hear that from time to time. In fact, that's what Beth was mentioning to me this morning, was about Hur, H-U-R, that was mentioned there in verse 2. All right, so before I forget, let's go back to Genesis 4. You guys will mark that. I may dabble around a little bit, but we're going to camp out there in Genesis 4. It's a story about Cain and Abel that we'll reference as we go through here. So here's some of the people that we're gonna study about in this class over the next few weeks, just so that you guys know. Maybe not in this order, and some of these may be combined, and there may be some others that we work in. And again, keep in mind, some of these are going to be people that you're familiar with: Cain, Abraham, Esau, Achan, Samuel, Saul, Abigail, Absalom, Rehoboam, Jabez, Naaman, Gehazi, and Uzziah. Okay? So some of those names, I know you're like, wait a minute, that sounds familiar, but I can't remember exactly where they are. Well, that's why we're going to study. We're going to see what we can learn from each of these folks. All right. A couple of questions that I want to ask you guys up front. And I don't know if other people do this as well. One of the things that I can't always apply like I want to, but one of the things that I have learned helps me, because when I read, my comprehension is not great. My mind wanders while I read, and I end up looking at the pages and turning them and going through it, but it's just not sinking in. Other people can read and get really deep into it, and it's just not one of the gifts that I have. So what I have learned is that sometimes it helps me is if there's questions at the end of a section, that I go and read those questions and I kind of understand a little bit about what the question is. Then I go back and read the material and I go, wait a minute, there was a question on that. And it prompts me to think about, oh, this is something that whoever wrote the questions at the end, this is something that they wanted me to learn about. And so that's one of the things that helps me kind of stay a little bit focused as we go through that. So here's a couple of things that maybe not specific to today's class, but over the course of this class, I would like you guys to kind of ponder and think about. Okay? Here's question 1. Would you rather be a person of significance or a person of renown? Now, if you're thinking, well, those are kind of similar, maybe you'll learn a little bit different as we go through there. So a person of significance or a person of renown. Now think about this. Between those two things, think about how, if that's a goal for you, to be a person of significance or to be a person of renown, if that's your goal, think about how that shapes your future and what you want to do. Think about how that would affect the decisions that you're going to make. Think about how that would affect the relationships that you're going to have. Because all the time, are you trying to be known for something, or you're just trying to be impactful as you think about it? Okay? Maybe even how you fulfill the role that God has given you, or the roles, because each of us have more than one role from that perspective. All right, so person of significance or a person of renown. Okay? The second one is, and again, this is going to be even more where you guys are going to say, can we have both? Which is more important to you? The quality of your impact on the world or the size of your impact on the world? It's kind of like a quality versus quantity is the way that I hear that. So think about, would you rather, what's more important to you, the quality of your impact or the size of your impact on the world? So, again, as I mentioned, some of the people that we're going to study about in this class had a positive impact. You guys will see that as we go through there, some of those that you're already familiar with. And then on the people and the world around them, others left kind of tragedies in their wake. And we're going to learn a little bit about that today. Obviously, the tragedy side as we think about Cain. So the way that Mr. Swindoll tees up each of these is he has a character and he has like a little phrase behind it. And especially this one was just kind of interesting if you think about it as a subheading. He titled this one Cain, a farmer who murdered his brother. Okay, so it's a very succinct way to put that, but I'm like completely accurate. It's just I've never thought about, okay, what did he do? And sorry, what did he do for a vocation and what did he do that we know him as? Can you guys think of anything else that we know that Cain necessarily did? He's literally brought in for us to learn a little bit about how the interaction between he and Abel, right? Did you start?
First murder.
Yeah, first murder. Yeah. But there's not a whole lot else we know. We know that he was, and what's interesting is, if you think about, I actually have this in the notes later, so if I repeat it, think about that he was the first child born. Other than that, God created the people. He was the first child born. So think about that. All of the children that have been born since then, and he was the first from that perspective. All right. So in general, murder, and I don't want to solicit too much and get us distracted, but murder seems to be one of those actions that people can take that's one of the worst things, if not the worst, right? And again, that's where I don't want to necessarily get into a debate. I know that there's a lot of things that people, and I say people collectively, that people can do to other people to impact them. And there's a lot of things that are very sad. There's a lot of things that just leave people with scars, physically, spiritually, mentally, everything. But when you think about murder, it's very final. Like, at least when there are other things that go on, that person will live to some degree, but they will their life isn't ended. They still have an opportunity to live and breathe and think and do other things. When murder is involved, that's it. There's a level of finality to that. And so that's where, when I say it's one of the worst actions by anyone, that's one of the things that I think about. Now, the author goes into a little bit of a study here thinking about, well, is murder more prevalent today than it was then and things like that. And he mentions some stats, but one of the things that I can think about, or that he mentioned that I think are relevant, is think about today that there's a lot of scenarios like this that may have happened in the past that we never knew about just because there wasn't a way for the news to get out. Now you hear about when somebody breathes out of their left nostril versus their right nostril, right? And you hear about all these things. So think about that there are probably a lot of things that have happened in the past that we may not have known about. Also think about that there's just lots more people. So when you had one murder for every 1,000 people, and that was a stat, and now think about how many more thousands of people. So just from a per capita perspective, murder probably may feel a little bit worse than it has in the past. But think too now, if the finality of murder, think about murder in a family and the challenge that poses. And think about it, if murder's bad enough, what about when it's murder within a family? So let's read Genesis 4. We're going to look at the first 8 verses first. And to just lay a little bit of the background, and then we'll come back and reference some of these topics. I know everybody's familiar with it, but I want to read it just so that you guys can see some of the topics that we're going to talk about. Again, my subheading says the initial conflict, which I kind of wonder if this was the initial conflict or if there was something else that led to this. Chapter 4, verse 1. Now Adam knew his wife, Eve. She conceived and bore Cain and said, I have acquired a man from the Lord. Then she bore again, and this time his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of the sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground to the Lord. Abel also brought of the firstborn of his flock and their fat, and the Lord respected Abel and his offering. Verse 5, but he did not respect Cain and his offering, and Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door, and its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. So let's go back and look at those. Obviously, there's more to the story. There's more to the story there, but let's look at those first as we go through. Is anybody else surprised that murder popped up so early in human lives? The author has Mr. Swindoll has a list of things that, like, you know, you might talk in, you know, we might have gone to fibs and then, you know, worked our way up to racketeering and then eventually somewhere down the way got into murder. But right here, I know books, chapters, and verse is kind of a human thing, but right here in the early part of our scripture, in chapter 4 of the entire book, the entire Bible, chapter 4, we first hear about murder. And if you think about 2, that's in the second generation of humans, right? And it's already coming about. I think it shows a little bit about how sin can affect our hearts. So keep that in mind a little bit, especially as we talk about this today. Murder being the result of a heart problem to some degree that's kind of inherent to us. It's built in a little bit. Maybe selfishness. And let's go back to when you see kids. I know we all once were kids, and we like to think that, well, we weren't that selfish, but we were at some point. And you think about that selfishness is inherited in us. It's part of who we are. We just learn, like other things, how to control it in most cases. Okay? So Cain, there's actually a slightly different spelling as it was in Hebrew, and I call this out because I thought it was really interesting. And this is where we'll go back to one of the one of the verses specifically as well. Cain in Hebrew, maybe a little bit of a wordplay here, but it means to acquire or create. So go back to the second part of chapter 4, verse 1. I have acquired a man from the Lord. Okay? We don't know if this is what Eve thought, or Adam and Eve thought about naming their child, but there is when it thinks about to acquire or create, it is obviously that she created this child, or she acquired this child from God, and she was recognizing that God had created people to this point, and she was the first human to help do that. So very interesting how that comes into play. And again, first child born ever, when you think about it from that perspective. Cain was a farmer like his dad. We just read how he was a tiller of the ground. Now, think about how that name comes into play. Think about what he did, and let's compare that to Abel. Abel in Hebrew means breath or vapor or futility, and he was a keeper of the flocks. Now, we don't know, and there's no specific verse that hints at how Abel ended up with his name. As a sidebar, I always think it's funny as, I shouldn't say funny, it's not an appropriate word, but I always think it's interesting when you read about names in the Bible, that we don't do this today, but there would be the name matches very closely with what they did. And to me, it always feels like a chicken egg thing. I'm like, well, did they do that because that's what their name was, or were they named that because what they did? Meaning, we go back and read, Bill means man who sits in front table in class, right? And it's like, well, he's doing that. Which one of those came first? And so it's very interesting sometimes how you can read into the words and read into the names and what those mean. But Abel, meaning breath or vapor or futility, again, keeper of the flocks. It's very interesting to me, again, to think about how that comes into play. Okay? Now, think about, too, a shepherd versus a farmer. Okay? Because that will come into play as well. Now, as I said, the little subheading said, initial conflict, at least in my translation. So what sparked the conflict? What do we read sparked the conflict? We just read it.
The Lord didn't accept his offering.
Lord didn't accept Cain's offering. Okay? Do you guys think that there was any sort of a conflict before then? We're not told.
I think there had to be.
If they were brothers.
There had to be, was one note.
Brothers, there's conflict if they're
Yes.
siblings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thought was, if they were brothers, and I'm hearing ... right? Meaning there had to have been some sort of a conflict there.
There's always going to be jealousy.
There's always going to be jealousy. There's always going to be something in that. And again, that's between kids, that's between cousins and family, but especially between brothers, an older brother, younger brother. He's getting it because he's the older one. He's doing this because he's the younger one. There's always some sort of a thing there. So again, we're not told of a lot of conflict, and I don't want to put things where they're not. But think about this specific conflict, but how it may have led into it. So we know Cain's offering was not good enough. It was from the fruit of the ground, which let's assume a lot of fruit doesn't necessarily come from the ground, but it was probably, think about wheat or something like that. There is a thought process where some people feel like that maybe it should have been a blood offering, right? Not necessarily a blood offering instead of something from the ground, as his first fruits, if you will, but maybe it should have been accompanied by a blood offering. Now, Abel's, there's no conflict, acceptable to God. That's all we know. Now, who do you guys think taught these two boys, men, however you want to refer to them, who do you guys think taught these two boys about giving back to God and this sacrifice and this offering? Parents, yep. Father. Let's go with Adam, right? Who do you think taught Adam about this? Okay, so we're not very far in that lineage, right? It's not one of those like the game of telephone where the further out you get, the more distorted the message gets. This is a very from God to Adam, Adam to the boys. So in that scenario, do you think, again, I don't want to speculate put things where they're not, but do you think that the boys got two different messages in that? They had to have gotten the same message, right? If you just think about it from that perspective. So hold that thought. Let's keep that for a little bit later as we go down through some of these things. All right. God to Adam. Yep. So whenever we think about that message and how that workflow, that flow went, we think about God, the patriarchs and how that came up. We don't need to know all the details. What we know is that there was a form of sacrifice, the spirit of which it was given are both important. Okay? Think about when we talk about in today's time, when we worship and we give back of our first fruits. Think about the verses that we recognize and that we often refer to. It's about what you're doing, but it's also about your spirit and your thought behind it. Okay? So think about the same thing with this offering from Cain and Abel. So one of the topics here you think about is obedience. The Lord is loving and kind, but he's also just. He's specific to how we come to him, but if you think about, he's also made it really simple for us, right? In today, we're spoiled a little bit. He's done everything for us. All we're asked to do is accept the gift. I mean, that's a pretty good, when I say we're spoiled, that's one of the things that I can think about, is that all that God has done through Jesus, his son, how that tees it up for us and makes it easier. The other part of that is, as you guys know, is that faith demands action. Action here is do what God says, when he says it, do it how he wants it done. And let's go back to Cain and Abel. Cain came into this his own way. He sort of, again, let's presume that Adam taught the boys the same, and Cain said, all right, here's what I'm going to do, and Abel said, here's what I'm going to do. Let me flip over, and I'll do this quickly. You guys don't have to turn there, just so I don't distract everybody too much. In fact, no, somebody else can read it. You guys got electronic Bibles, you can get there before me. Hebrews 11, verse 4. As soon as somebody gets there, read Hebrews 11, verse 4.
By faith, Abel offered to God a more excellent sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it, he being dead still speaks.
Okay? So, again, remember we talked about very early on, there are a lot of ties from Old Testament, New Testament. This is one we're in Hebrews, referring back to, a lot of Hebrews obviously referring to, based on what the book is about, refers back to this. But again, we learn a little bit about the how and part of that obedience and the action that comes into play. Now, let me ask you guys this. You can just tell me true or false. Our relationship with God affects a lot of other things. Okay? So I think about this, again, to some degree, and very simple, is that our vertical relationship to God affects a lot of horizontal things. Because I think of our relationship here, to some degree, to be very horizontal. So my relationship to God affects how I interact with each of you and how each of you interact with each other. What was Cain's first response? In verse 5, I'll give you a hint. You guys probably know it. What was his first response whenever? What was that?
I don't know.
Don't know. Okay. What about when we read in verse 5? It talks about his countenance falling. Okay. Angry. Yeah. Anger is one of those things. Now, when you think about, you can kind of see sometimes anger on somebody's face, right? And you can tell there's something going on in their mind and their spirit. And that's it's kind of what countenance means, is at their face. So it's like, look, I can read God's saying, I can read your face. There's something going on. Why are you so angry? And we know now, obviously we see that, and God obviously knew that there was jealousy involved. Now, if we have something going on in our life with God, how does that happen today? That if we have something going on in our spiritual life, that it has an impact on that horizontal line? Yes, yeah, definitely does. What's interesting though is think about jealousy. Whenever jealousy occurs, a lot of times, feels a little bit different from Cain and Abel. Whenever there's jealousy before, how do I want to say this? Just think about yourselves. If you've had times, or people that you know of, so you don't put it on yourselves. If you've seen jealousy involved, and where it's involved, where does the reaction to it happen? And let me go back to Cain and Abel for a second. Who did not approve of what Cain had done? God. So Cain took it out on his brother, right? So you see there the relationship that God and Cain had, and that's where the disapproval was, and he decided that jealousy, he was going to take it out on his brother from that perspective. A lot of times, or I shouldn't say, sometimes that jealousy comes back to whoever was the person involved in that jealousy. But in this case, it was a conflict between God and Cain that caused the jealousy, and that jealousy to brew from that perspective. You guys think Cain was angry with himself? Do you guys ever, I know I do, whenever I have challenges, I get mad at myself way more than I get mad at other people. So I think that there's a thing, when you think about his countenance falling and him being angry, to me, I think a lot of that is him just being angry with himself. All right, so Cain killed Abel for his resentments to God. Choosing to do wrong puts a person at odds with himself. Okay? When we look at, in verse 6 and 7, what God said to Cain, and in fact, let me read, there's a section here in the book, and a lot of times I'll refer back to the book if there's something that I don't feel like I'm can kind of recap enough. But this is very plainly said that the author actually pulled from another author. Cain began badly by presenting a sinful offering before God. Abel gave God the best, whereas Cain merely brought an offering. When God rejected his offering, Cain complicated the problem by responding wrongly to the rejection. The anger and depression were noted by God, who observed that this was a wrong response. And instead, God says, "Do right, and you will feel right." Then God warned against failure to repent and offered the right kind of sacrifice. Now, from our perspective, if you continue to complicate the problem with a sinful response, you will fall into deeper sin. So think about that, and I think that we know that a lot of times. That's why we get mad at ourselves, is because we know that sometimes when we have done something wrong or something that we know God might not be pleased with, we get mad at ourselves because we know that there can be a kind of a trickle-down effect from that perspective. We also can read in verse 7, back to our scripture. If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Unresolved sin, again, let's go back to that vertical relationship. Unresolved sin can corrupt everything. If you got something that's sitting out there, there can be quite an impact to it. So let me ask you guys this, and something the author mentioned, but I think is absolutely spot on, is that leaving a sin unresolved makes us vulnerable to more sin. Think about that for a second. If you feel like you have a challenge between you and God, you're sort of on the edge, and let the record show I'm standing at the edge of a carpet line here, right? You're sort of on the edge, and you're kind of, you've made yourself more vulnerable, because there's a couple of ways that you can do. You can resolve that with God, and step away from that edge, or you can say, well, I'm already here, and you end up falling down other paths, and that sin just kind of continues to snowball a little bit. What's interesting is, and I know it's been said different ways, but I think if sin were seen as a crazy, ugly, monstrous beast, we would be able to kind of see it and stay away from it and all those things. Now, it is what it is, right? But sin, to some degree, is opportunistic. It's gonna come at us when we are at our worst, when we're at that edge, if you will. We have to take responsibility, though, and think about, too, what the advice that young couples always get as they're approaching marriage or shortly after marriage is, what's the phrase? Do not go to bed angry, right? And it sounds cliche, but there's a lot of good advice in that. But it's the same thing between us and God. Because what you don't want to do is have things go unresolved. Just like with a husband and wife, especially a new husband and wife, you don't want things to go unresolved because it's going to fester and it's just going to make things worse. And it's no different in our relationship with God from that perspective. So don't go to bed angry. Now, the question is, did Cain heed God's advice and the resentment he had built? No, he didn't, right? All right, so what we want to do is we want to make sure that we want to have that in mind, that we want to resolve the conflicts. The same heart, this goes back to something we mentioned a little bit earlier, the same heart that Cain inherited the fall from is the same heart that beats within each of us. So, to my knowledge, as I look around the room, none of us are murderers, or that I know of. Not expecting everybody to raise their hands, right? But think about, again, people aren't murderers right off the bat. There's something that's led them to that point. They don't just wake up one day and say, hey, here's what I'm going to do, right? We talked about the initial conflict. There's something that built up to this. And it's the same thing that this is sort of something that's in our DNA. It's something in our heart that's happened all the way at the beginning, from Adam and Eve and the fall, all the way to us. And we have to figure out we want to make sure that we're managing that. Again, when resentment is there, if we let it fester, it's going to sprout, if you will. And not only is it going to sprout this way, it's going to dig in roots, and it's going to build, and eventually somewhere in some people that gets to murder to some degree, okay? Unresolved sin also hardens the heart. Would you guys agree with that? Yes. Yeah. So you have those things out there. Now you start trying to justify different things, just like Cain did. There might have been something in his mind. Think about this, and I haven't heard it put this way, but obviously this has been said from the pulpit before. A secret sin on earth is open scandal in heaven. So think about something that you might only feel like it's between you and God, but that's a challenge, that it's something that God knows. And so we may feel like it's a secret here, but it's definitely not a secret from God's perspective. So we read about in verses 11 and 12. We didn't read it during class, but as you go a little further from that story, justice comes in verse 11 and 12. And then we actually get a little bit of emotion from Cain in verses 13 and 14. He's actually, I'm not going to say remorse, but you can feel in verse 13 and 14 that there's a little bit more to that. Cain, in verse 13, Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is greater than I can bear. Surely you have driven me out this day from the face of the ground, and I shall be hidden from your face. I shall be a fugitive and a vagabond on the earth. It will happen that anyone who finds me will kill me. So he's finally realizing kind of what's going on, and we can see that that's kind of coming into play, some emotional, like there is a human kind of involved in this.
Right.
Yes?
I don't want to, I'm not going to hijack the last couple of minutes, but in 1 John chapter 3, verse 12, it says we should not be like Cain, who was of the evil one and murdered his brother. So the idea here, when it says he's of the evil one, the wording there entails that this is a man who was a sinful man. This was part of his character, was he was a sinful man.
Yep.
This whole thing was not over one small instance of him giving the wrong sacrifice. This is a guy that was willful and stubborn and sinful and
Yeah,
had no desire to change.
yeah, and something was festering.
Yeah.
Yes.
He
Look how
said,
quickly he minds.
it says, and why did he murder him? He says, because his own deeds were evil and his brothers were righteous.
Yeah. Now, think about when we read this, it's always easy for us to play, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna use a sports metaphor, the Monday morning quarterback, where we're like, he got what he deserved and all those different things. But look at how God gives him grace in verse 15. Lord said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on him, lest anyone should find him, should not kill him. So think about the grace that we have from God, even though that we have the challenges that we do. We see that all this story, we're like, why would God give him grace? But we don't question it when that grace is on us. So keep that in mind as you read those things. So we know it's not a happy ending. But let's think about, again, last couple of minutes, what we can learn. God's way is the only way. And it's the only acceptable way, and we should be able to take it. Keep in mind, jealousy is not a sin, much like any others that can be hidden. Right? There are those things that are in our lives that might appear, we think they're hidden, but they're visible to others, and it reflects that relationship. And we want to never leave that sin or conflict unresolved, especially with God. A couple of other things that I'll pull up to what we think about in today's term. Resolving our conflict, we have to start with that relationship with God. You heard people say, own it. Well, we need to own it, and we need to be accountable. And we're not going to be able to fix things here until we fix things here in that vertical relationship with God. Make peace with yourself and know that that will help in the peace for those around you, between your relationships with those around you. All right? Thank you guys again very much for being here. Appreciate your time, and look forward to learning from some other people in the Bible. It was the one from you.